Just as it was in full retreat and Brasidas was passing on to attack the right, he received a wound. But his fall was not perceived by the Athenians, as he was taken up by those near him and carried off the field. The Athenian right made a better stand, and though Cleon, who from the first had no thought of fighting, at once fled and was overtaken and slain by a Myrcenian Peltast, his infantry formed in close order upon the hill, and twice or thrice repulsed the attacks of Clearidas, and did not finally give way until they were surrounded and routed by the missiles of the Myrcenian and Chalcidian cavalry and Peltast, and then with difficulty made their way to Aeon. The men who had taken up and rescued Brasidas brought him into the city with the breath still in him. He lived to hear of the victory of his troops, and not long after expired. It's been 10 years since the war between Athens and Sparta broke out. 10 long years of pain and suffering, which had left both sides of the war exhausted. However, Cleon and Brasidas, each their city's foremost jingoists, had both just met their ends on the battlefield in Amphipolis, providing both powers' peace factions an unique opportunity to negotiate an end to hostilities. Let's begin by taking a look at the Spartan state of affairs. Sparta was weary of renewing any offensives in Attica, fearing that in doing so it will doom a considerable part of its elite and troops, which the Athenians were holding captive, to death. And Brasidas' strategy in the Athenians' outer sphere of influence was an unsustainable drain in precious resources and manpower, making his death the perfect opportunity to abandon the endeavor. Likewise, Pylos was still under Athenian control, and the Helots were nearing a full-scale rebellion. Perhaps more importantly, the peace treaty with Argos was nearing its expiration date, and Sparta increasingly saw itself under an ever-tightening noose, with enemies all around it and increasingly dissatisfied allies, even more so than they were when they pressured Sparta to war with Athens against Archidamus's correct assessment that shock and awe would serve little against a fortified, well-supplied economic powerhouse. The Athenians, however, did not reap the benefits of their enemies' perceived misfortunes. The plague, likely some sort of viral hemorrhagic fever such as Ebola, that devastated the city was still fresh on everyone's minds, and the city felt its empire had overextended, failing to make any real gains, and with rebellious sentiment dominating throughout its holdings in Thrace. Thing is, Athens had a real shot at going on the offensive real soon. As we've seen, the Argives were nearly free of their crucial commitments with Sparta, and they could be a game changer for Athens, which still had a considerable amount of valuable Spartan prisoners to use as bargaining chips, and which Sparta could therefore not make use of in combat. However, even though Athens clearly had the upper hand at this time in resources, finances, and the chance to soon have a new power from the Peloponnesian Peninsula join its side, the city chose to go for peace over dealing with what would seem to be minor and temporary inconveniences along the war's outer theaters. Why was this then? I think Donald Kagan's argument has merit in pointing out the following. Imagine that over the past 10 years, your homeland has been at war. Your properties have been destroyed. You've been confined for months at a time within cramped city walls, which imprisoned you during the worst epidemic in living history. Your city's overseas holdings, on which you now depend because your productive enterprises have been ravaged with seasonal incursions, harbor open discontent for your rule. You're drying up your nation's coffers with each passing season, and all the while, you have been promised that if you hold out for just a while longer, you will live to see the glory of victory. Athens was longing for peace, not because it could not win the war, but because it no longer wanted to be at war, even if it meant an unsatisfactory end to a decade of killing with little to nothing to show for it. With this in mind, peace soon followed. The treaty essentially amounted to a status quo antebellum, with Athens and Sparta returning their respective gains, with the notable exceptions of Nicaea, which remained under Athenian control, much to Megare's disdain, as it happened to be its equivalent to Athens' Piraeus, and Plataea, which the treaty considered to have voluntarily become a Theban tributary. Additionally, the Spartans abandoned their military adventure in the north, spelling the end of the Thracians' fight for independence. However, in order to achieve the peace it desired, Athens had to let go of its leverage on Sparta, freeing its prisoners, which had essentially acted as its primary deterrent against the Peloponnesians, leaving few practical security guarantees in place thereafter. Athens had survived, and one might even argue that it came out victorious from the Archidanian War. However, Sparta's defeat, if we can call it that, was not in detail, as Pericles had envisioned a post-war Hellenic order in which Athens was the sole hegemon among the Greek city-states, where it could comfortably maintain its empire and exert a near monopoly on power projection, a Pax Pericleia of the Hellenic world, or an early Fukuyamon end to history. This was not and could not be achieved by this stage of the war, and it required the Athenian people to perform an Herculean task, to endure even more painful labors, when what they wished for was peace.
Estou a gravar agora a Kiki está com um prop.
Não, por mim ela pode aparecer.